Hi everyone, and welcome to this Museums Association Coronavirus Conversation webinar. Today we're looking at the climate crisis and museums' role in tackling this, whether that's reducing their environmental impact, raising awareness or taking direct action themselves. My name is Rebecca Atkinson from the Museums Association, and I'll be facilitating today. In a moment, I'm going to hand over to our chair, Alistair Brown, Policy Manager at the MA, to introduce our speakers and get the conversation started. But first, I just have some quick housekeeping announcements to make. Please do use the chat function now and during the discussion to say hi to each other, to let us know where you're attending from, and to share your own experiences and thoughts on this issue. The chat will also be available afterwards on request. If you have a question that you'd like to put to the panelists, then please pop this in the Q&A, which Alistair will be monitoring throughout. And if you want to tweet, then today's hashtag is #MACoronavirusConversations. I won't be locking this webinar, so if you need to leave or your internet drops out, then you can rejoin again. And we will be recording, so it will be available on the MA's website as a recording as soon as possible after the event. As always, please bear with us if there are any technical problems, and please remember to follow the MA's Code of Conduct in the chat. I'm going to pop a link in there now. Right, I'm going to hand over to Alistair to get started, although I can't see him on screen. Alistair, would you like to join? There he is. I panicked then. Okay.
Never fear. Thanks, Rebecca, and it's wonderful to be here today, and thank you to everybody who's joining this call from the UK and from around the world. So let's get started, and what I'll do just to begin with is to introduce myself and the panel that we have with us today. My name is Alistair Brown. I'm the Policy Manager at the Museums Association, and I will be chairing the discussion today, and I can say a bit more about some of the other things that we've been doing at the Museums Association around climate crisis issues in a moment. But before I do that, I'll introduce the panel that we have in front of us. So I'll start with Miranda Massie, who is the director and founder of New York's Climate Museum, which has the mission to inspire action on the climate crisis with programming across the arts and sciences that deepens understanding, builds connections, and advances just solutions. Miranda left a career in social justice law in 2014 to lay the groundwork for the museum, which had its first breakout year of public programming in 2018. During the COVID pandemic, the museum has developed new climate advocacy tools and a series of online workshops and conversations to provide constituencies with opportunities for connection during the pandemic. Next on our panel is Alexandra Alberda, and Alexandra is the first ever curator of Indigenous perspectives at the Manchester Museum, which she joined from Bournemouth University, where she was a doctoral researcher in graphic medicine and curatorial practice, and a research illustrator. Her research critically engages with institutional structures of power that limit civic engagement and do not facilitate needed reparative reconciliation, amplification of marginalized voices, and displacement of colonial power. And finally, on our panel today, we have Isla Gladstone, who is the Senior Curator of Natural Sciences at Bristol Museums. Isla Gladstone is, as I said, the Senior Curator at Bristol Museums. Her current work is focusing on climate and ecological crisis and how colonial collections can help empower a just, fair and inclusive action against the global emergencies that we're facing today. So we've got a fantastic panel, and I just wanted to start off by putting today's discussion in a little bit of context. The discussion that we're having today is around climate crisis and the wider biodiversity crisis and how museums can contribute to challenging them. And of course, there is the time has already passed, if you like, to seize this issue and to really make progress on it. 2020 was the second hottest year on record. There are 417 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere, when we know that a safe level is no higher than 350 parts per million. That's a rate that's growing far too quickly year on year. So we know that the world is locked on the wrong path, both in terms of the climate crisis and a wider biodiversity crisis that sees countless species extinct or at risk of extinction. And from a museum's perspective, we think that museums have multiple roles to play in helping to pull the whole planet back from the brink. And one thing that we really want to do as the Museums Association is to increase activity and focus on this area. And part of that is through today's conversation, but also with an increasing range of resources and help for the sector on our website, and hopefully in future through in-person events. And just looking back at a few of the things that we've done recently around climate crisis issues, just from a kind of policy and advocacy point of view, which is where I take the lead at the Museums Association. In 2019, we joined with other cultural organisations to declare a climate emergency, and to work hard to increase the profile of climate issues within the arts and culture sector. And then obviously in the past year, we have lobbied for a just and green cultural recovery from the COVID crisis. And there are a number of key actions that we've called for as part of that just and green recovery. And you can read more about them on our website. I'd really encourage you to do that. And there should be some links going up in the chat that help direct you to those sections of our website. And then finally, I think that timing is important, and the timing of this event is all the more important as we approach the COP26 conference of the parties in Glasgow, that's happening in the autumn. And this is really, it's a delayed opportunity for the UK, for museums in the UK especially, to put themselves centre stage and share their approaches to the climate crisis with the rest of the world. So let's find out more about these issues, about these questions, with our amazing panel today. And I'm going to start by launching into a few questions for the panel, and then later on this afternoon we'll have a chance for others to pitch in with their questions as well. And the first question that I wanted to ask the panel is a really broad one. It's kind of taking us back right to square one, which is this question about whether museums do have a real role to play in tackling the climate crisis, and if they do have a role to play in tackling the climate crisis, where do they fit into the bigger picture, the big picture that policymakers are looking at when they think about how they're going to reduce the amount of carbon in our atmosphere, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to pitch that question first to Miranda, and then I'll ask the same to our other panelists.
Well, thank you so much, Alistair and Rebecca, and to the Museums Association in general, and to everybody who's here sharing your time with us. There's not a more important subject than the climate crises, plural, which include the crises of inequality of different kinds. And it's a joy to see the Museums Association engaging with these questions in such a serious way. It's wonderful. So I'm delighted to be here from New York. And I will say, I think the role of museums and cultural institutions is absolutely critical in building toward progress on these emergencies. We have enormous popularity and enormous public trust, and we're a public good. And the commons has been eroded a lot in the last 50 years. So part of our job is more generally to help restore that sense of public good and public space and public trust. But with the algebraic combination of popularity and public trust, there's huge transformational potential emotionally and ideologically that resides in the places where we work. And it is absolutely imperative on a moral basis that we not leave that on the ground. It has to be mobilized to help build for the kind of broad climate engagement that we're going to need for the action that's required, which at this point, as everybody here knows, is incredibly difficult, aggressive, ambitious action sustained over a long period of time at all levels of government and across the private sector. It's an absolutely all hands on deck situation. And to sustain that effort, to initiate it in the first place, and then to sustain it, means we need a climate vanguard, absolutely. And beyond that, a broadly and robustly engaged climate public. And I view part of our job as helping to create the conditions for that and helping that public to grow. We've found in the US, last quick point, we know that 66% of US adults are freaked out about the climate crisis. 64% of us, it's almost a mirror image, rarely or never speak about it. That's not going to work for the long term. So that's what we need to change. And that's what we have the power and the duty to change.
Fantastic, thanks Miranda. And without further ado, I'll put the same question to Isla, please.
Thank you. Well, just to echo Miranda in thanking you for inviting me here today. I mean, my work focuses on natural science collections, looking at sort of effects of biodiversity loss from climate crisis. And I see museums in having key roles, both in engagement, as Miranda said, and in research as well. So in terms of engagement, we're spaces that perhaps we're mainstream spaces that can perhaps sit outside some of those mainstream narratives to create different ways of connecting with this crisis. So opportunities through all types of museums to provide a more perhaps holistic connection, or shifts in thinking, which is perhaps what we require at this time, you know, shifts in thinking, but ensuring also through our opportunities with engaging with objects, with engaging with the past, with engaging with structures, colonial structures, that we're able to promote action and shifts that are just, fair and inclusive, so that I think museums have a really important role in that. We can give sort of experiences that resonate with people, that, you know, promote conversation, connect it to the local, connect it to the historic and the global. So I think museums have huge potential in terms of engagement. The way we do that needs to be both urgently but with care, bearing in mind those colonial histories that many of our organisations have, and that structural racism and inequality that exists in our institutions, but that we can expose and use to create better future approaches. Also just reflecting on research, so museums look after primary sources, objects and archives, and that can help empower solutions through communities both locally and across the world. An example is natural science collections, which are the biggest source of biodiversity data in the world. The UK, given its colonial history, has material not only from Britain, but also around the world. And we're really very far behind in terms of digitizing and releasing this data to share it globally as a primary source. That's just one example that goes across different types of collections. Archival images, for example, we have colleagues working with archival images, trying to release early pictures of development of cities that are now empowering communities to challenge the way their cities are developing in the global south, for example. So to answer your question shortly, yes, museums have a big role. We have a responsibility as cultural institutions, and the ways we can do that are quite broad, but I think we have a unique role potentially as well, as Miranda says.
Fantastic, thanks Isla. There's already lots to pick up on. I've got lots of follow-up questions already, but I will hand straight over to Alexandra, and then we'll come back to some of the other questions.
Hi, yes, and same. Thank you for inviting me here. I just want to reiterate, there's so much that needs to be done, and we are in such a privileged position to do that. And I think also because we can start, what is needed on so many things with museums is a cultural shift. It's not just changing our practices, it's not just changing our buildings, but we're in need, dire need of shifting our cultures and what a museum culture is, and also how we can then be one place that publics go to kind of help in having these conversations that also affect individual ways that we express our culture and things we bring in to develop our culture to be kinder to the environment, but also to each other. And so in my role as the curator of Indigenous perspectives, when my role got announced, the first two things, I got a bunch of people reaching out to me, and it fell into two categories. One, how can museums be a part of building education around Indigenous cultures and perspectives? And the other one was on climate crisis and climate burning. So that is definitely, in me being led by the people that I represent, was listening. And so I think we have a great opportunity here to bring in other cultures and combine those efforts. So combining efforts of decolonization and indigenization into how we tackle these things and into how we respond in a way that, as others have said, builds resonance between these different things, where we can have both very local, meaningful engagement with what we're doing, but also reaching out across to other communities. And just one example, because my position sits across nature and culture collections. And what Isla was saying, no, I think I mispronounced that, I'm sorry, was that we have used our collections in a very live and active way. So how we put more life into these, and I think that's one way we can be a part of the bigger picture, is reminding people that our culture is alive and our institutions reflect life. And so one thing that got announced with the Manchester Museum, because we have a vivarium, so we have live animals, is that today we announced, as part of the UN's Wildlife Day, that we have successfully been the first institution outside of Panama to breed the variable harlequin toad. And that is so huge when it comes to conservation. And we might think that's happening in a museum. It's not happening in the zoos that we see on TV, or these other places we might think, but there's different and creative and imaginative ways that we can use our position and our resources and our collections that are so great and have so much information to contribute to this, and invite other collaborators in. So I think we have an opportunity there, and to also reshape our values and mission statement, like the Manchester Museum has done in the last 2 years around care, imagination, and inclusivity.
Fantastic. Yeah, again, lots to chew on, and great to hear about the vivarium and the success that you're having there in Manchester. And we've got a link to the aforementioned toad in the chat as well, if people want to see it. Yeah, I mean, so look, that was a really good summary of sort of the big picture sense of why museums need to be in this debate and in this space, and a little bit about what museums are beginning to think about doing. And there's a bit there about being institutions that build public trust. There's a bit there about being institutions that reflect as well the colonial past and indigenous populations, and bringing those ideas together to help deal with the climate crisis, the biodiversity challenges that we're facing. What then do you think should actually be museums' biggest priority in terms of dealing with the climate crisis? Because you've thrown quite a lot of different elements in there, but I think, you know, for the benefit of all of the people joining the webinar today, you know, what should museum professionals who are watching this conversation be doing if they want to be helping to challenge the problems that we're facing with the climate crisis? And I'm going to go to Isla first on this one.
Thanks. So I guess, I mean, a really important thing someone's already mentioned is that ability to listen to our communities. So where are our communities now, our communities and stakeholders? What do they need from us? So for example, in Bristol, there's been a recent survey that went right across the city, through all areas, through all different backgrounds, through all levels of privilege and deprivation, and found that 94% of people across Bristol accept climate change, but are also very worried about it. So there is not a need that there may have been maybe 3 years ago even to kind of be saying climate change is happening. People are aware it's happening. They know what they need to be doing at an individual level, in Bristol at least, but people are really worried about it. People also, they found related it in the kind of the experience they were given. They were talking about kind of far off, long away impacts, you know, ice caps melting, polar bears, that kind of thing, and didn't have that real understanding of how it relates to our city and how our city is globally interconnected in a more immediate way to what's going on around the world, if that makes sense. So I guess, yeah, that ability to kind of listen and be relatively agile in what we understand the need is as well. These things change quite quickly. To sort of critically reflect and listen, critically reflect on our own practice. I guess we need to be open to transformative change at this time. For example, I work with a natural science collection. You might think quite a sort of traditional collection, historic collection. For example, we look after a world, we've got world wildlife, world species, gorilla, giraffe, that kind of thing, taxidermy animals collected from around the world that we no longer collect and has been seen as a relatively historic, sort of out of date, old fashioned collection perhaps. But we've started to explore its contemporary relevance and actually to really challenge ourselves in thinking that contemporary relevance is not necessarily the traditional relevance. So we've traditionally used this collection to educate people about world species. And we started to disrupt that by thinking actually people in our museum, we interviewed them, although we have labels talking about threat, extinction threat to these species, really had no idea of the extent of threat to wild animals. So we just did a simple disruption, kind of elevating our labeling by using a transparent black material over the animals that were threatened, essentially, and that transformed that space. So kind of simple, critical changes that we can make now. But also it brought us huge learning. It's made us continue to challenge and reflect on our practice. So the way we did some of our messaging took its framework from very Western environmental practice, mainstream practice that talks about wildlife in the absence of people. So as Alexandra was saying, nature, but without culture, without peoples alongside. That talks about humans causing extinction, these kind of narratives that come very much from white Western practice, and that we're deeply embedded in as a colonial collection. But at this time, we need to be challenging, and we need to be using this colonial history, this way of looking, for example, at wild wildlife in our instance, but will apply across lots of different institutions, and disrupting that. So it can be a tool for practitioners to learn from, take those with them. But also, as Alexandra will know much more than me, you know, we have collections that can help us bring more diverse narratives. So, you know, the world's wildlife is not only known by white Westerners, it is known by people who live alongside it. When we take action for wildlife, we take actions that affect people as well. The things driving extinction are driving inequality and pain for people who live alongside. So yeah, I guess it's kind of critically reflecting on our practice, really listening to communities, and being open to challenging our practice as well, and listening to people who probably know more about it than we do in certain instances.
Fantastic, thanks, Isla. Yeah, and I can see that we've got some questions coming in on the Q&A function already. That's fantastic. If you've got more questions that you want the panel to address at the end of this section, then please do jump in and ask stuff on the Q&A. But before that, I'm going to pass over to Alexandra and ask about your experience and what you think, you know, the people watching this call should be doing.
Yeah, and I think that's great because it segues nicely. You, what Isla was saying is something I was gonna get across too, and that was that we need to start from a place of humility informed by Indigenous knowledge. It can be other knowledges, but this is the one that I think has a lot that we can learn from, as Isla was saying, because they live alongside and there's just a different culture. Because there's a culture of living in a symbiotic relationship with nature and not conquering it or not trying to control it or categorize it, but living and listening, really listening to the land, listening to non-human relatives and species to kind of inform where our solutions come from, as well as communities. So what I was going to say was establishing, fostering, and maintaining a community and environment of humility based on multi-generational thinking and solutions that are emergent from the landscapes. that each of our museums are in. And so in establishing our humility, what is really important with that is that in museums, we start acknowledging how we contribute to the climate crisis, making statements of positionality and accountability. So what have we done? What do we hope to do? And making these public, not kind of hiding these histories, but expressing them. Because when we do those things, we model to publics or other people how we might have these conversations in our private lives. I mean, Miranda mentioned that people don't want to talk about these things. We don't know how to, they're quite overwhelming. So how can even how we discuss and how we think in public can model these things? And one thing that Rebecca will put in the chat at some point, but I think everyone should read this book. It is Red Alert, Saving the Planet with Indigenous Knowledge by Daniel Wildcat. It was published, I believe, in 2009, but unfortunately, we've not done a lot to make what he's calling for outdated. But something that got brought there that I've been hearing a lot in Indigenous kind of consultations I've been a part of is 7 generations thinking. So I think what we really do with museums is we need to slow down, especially with their not in tackling climate crisis, but in some of the things that we're being led into, the fast fashion of museums, putting on exhibition after exhibition, being bright and colorful and bringing people in, but maybe having excessive practices that put plastics and chemicals and these things in. And so we need to slow down. We need to start thinking about what our action plans are. And so 7 generations thinking, depending on who you talk to, for the Sami people in Northern Europe, that is, you are 1 generation and you're thinking 6 generations in the future when you make plans, when you make those changes, and those are the people you're concerned about. And so I think that would really help. Whereas in North America, you tend to be in the middle of that 7 generations, learning from 3 generations in the past and trying to do good by 3 generations in the future. And so even though that seems a bit linear, it becomes a part of something that breaks away from that linear kind of cause and effect and how it immediately affects you. But also what Daniel Wildcat calls for is solutions that are emergent from the land. So I think in fostering this and maintaining this is, when was the last time we looked out the windows of our own museums? We looked for green spaces. We looked physically what is out there and thought, in our action plans, in our capital projects. I mean, maybe a lot of people have been doing this. And so what do I need to create for my community? What is needed there? Not just aesthetic greenery, but things that people can engage with, and things that really build up the city, start to break away some concrete. So that also involves collaborators that know things we don't. So Isla's already said that, is who can we bring in that can build on that knowledge and those solutions and can help us kind of break away from maybe things we don't realize are quite ingrained in us and might be getting in the way. So we need those creative thinkers that have the knowledge we don't have. And then maintaining that relationship and maintaining that humility, it is also about giving your employees, giving the staff members time to think in these spaces, time to read these books, time to get away from all of this and just think and contemplate. And that's what they need. And that's where, as Miranda was talking about, we start getting into the intersectional manner of climate crises, where we bring in social and racial injustices. And it's at that point, as we're maintaining this, we add on more things that we could be doing to improve our culture of museums and what we allow ourselves to do.
Brilliant. Wow. Loads to do there, and a big reading list for everyone on the call as well. Miranda, you've had some fascinating experience of doing this and researching around this at the Climate Museum. What's your take? What works and what can people be doing and emulating?
Well, it's fantastic, Isla and Alexandra, to hear your guys' thoughts on this, and I roundly second them all, and appreciate the bibliography. Robin Wall Kimmerer's book is on the bed behind me, at the very top of my list, so I'll pick up copies of the others as well. One of the things that I'm really struck by is how different our problems and opportunities are from institution to institution. So for example, as a new and explicitly activist museum, and in the North American context, we don't have a vivarium. We don't even have a collection, really. We certainly don't have a natural history collection, but I think the key thing is to start with an assessment, a clear-eyed assessment of what your problems and opportunities are and how you can intervene in the former and use the latter to direct our constituencies toward climate engagement and toward feeling empowered to have even that first conversation about climate with somebody they already know, which for us doesn't seem like a big deal, but every week I gain a deeper understanding, even after 3 years of publicly programming, how hard those first steps are, because we all are taught to feel complicit and ashamed of our consumer habits. It's very convenient for big oil. BP invented the term carbon footprint. They want us focused on our own complicity. So getting away from that, and also getting away from the feeling of being just radically outscaled, as we all are individually, by the global nature of these crises of inequality and climate disruption that we face. So giving people tools to feel connected and that their action is in community. And I think that those, for us, I'll say, those two being open on a continual basis to the accumulation of new barnacle problems, because even at a new institution, it happens so fast that you get locked into a way of seeing things. And with the climate crisis accelerating so rapidly and the cultural context in which we're intervening also changing so quickly, having a very radically open and agreed humble mind is critically important, but also being unafraid to define our own goals. I would advocate for that. And for us at the Climate Museum, that means helping to create the conditions for a wave of broader public engagement, contributing to that alongside many other partners and many other institutions and many other interventions. And part of that is also recognizing that a big fight we're facing ahead is to dismantle the social license to operate of the fossil fuel industry. And I raise that because I think museums have a particular obligation as public trusts not to accept resources from that sector. And that's one of the things that's hard about being a new museum is you don't have any money at all. And equally, one of the things that's easier is that you don't have the accumulated patterns of accepting money from sectors that are mission inconsistent. And I think that communicating broadly, both about the imperative of civic facing climate action and the need to expose the illegitimacy of the industry that wants to keep burning all of the fossil important work that everybody in the meeting can contribute to without any of us being able to accomplish it on our own, of course.
That's absolutely fascinating. I think really interesting reflections on sort of the personal versus the social and political aspects of the challenge ahead of us. And I'm sure that we'll get into more of that in the chat later on. I think that's really at the sort of the crux of things, isn't it? Yeah, I think you also touched on something else there, Miranda, that actually neatly leads into my next question, which is the fact that every museum faces slightly different challenges in terms of what it's got in front of it, what tools it has at its disposal, what collections it has that are relevant to the discussion that are going on. But also that kind of question of leadership. You're in the position of being the leadership of a museum that is all about climate. Most museums aren't in that position, and I think, and I wonder actually if the panel have any reflections on how you move this issue of climate crisis and the need to engage publics with the questions of climate crisis and biodiversity crisis. How do you move them up the internal priority list? How do you get climate crisis to the top of the pile of your director or your board of trustees? Alexandra, I'm going to start with you for this one.
Yeah, I think I will put a disclaimer that I'm quite lucky, and when I both of the museums I spent the most time in, that was always on the agenda by the time I was there. So I think I'm quite lucky. The Great Plains Art Museum in Nebraska was partnered with the Center for Great Plains Research. So I think that was one way, was that because they had that relationship and they shared a director, and we shared a lot of different people, and we were in the same building, that having those researchers present and running events through the museum based on their stuff was really helpful. But the Manchester Museum is also all about that. I think our director is a part of countless different boards across the city. So maybe it's asking what kind of citywide stuff you could be a part of. And we also have said no to money from certain sources, and are actually going into policies and procedures and rewriting those. Because if we're talking about that cultural change and that institutional change, even though that can seem boring, it is really important work that needs to be done, is rewriting these things and getting the right people in those spots. So having that person who's willing to say, yeah, we can't accept money from them, or we need to question this person. Where does their money come from? Even if it's an individual and not from a bigger organization or company. So I think, but in doing that, I have worked in behavioral change and public health in the past. And what I found was really useful, but also kind of sometimes pulled at my humanitarian heartstrings, was I had to change how I spoke. I had to think, whose mind am I trying to change? What kind of wording do they use? What kind of values do they use? Because climate change is so pervasive, and the crisis, that I can talk in different languages, different value systems to try to convince them. And when you're up against a wall, what's really helped us was who we bring in to have that conversation. So with the Harlequin Toad, that wasn't just us. That was, and I want to make sure I get their name right, I wrote it down. That was with collaborative conversation with Panama Wildlife Conservation. And so they can help us to talk about the needs, to bring those in, and they bring the weight of the work they've been doing into the conversation. And if you frame that in the public, then hopefully that puts extra pressure and they can help ask the tough questions. But I think it's purposefully, in a reciprocal way, seeing who you can bring in to start to shift that change if in isolation you as an institution are finding resistance.
Yeah, Isla, I'm going to go to you.
Yeah, similarly, we're in a lucky position in Bristol. Our city was the first, I think, to declare climate emergency in the UK, first to declare ecological emergency. So the context that we sit within are very supportive, and that really helps. I guess if you don't sit within those frameworks, it's finding frameworks that are relevant to your institution, a bit like Alexandra was saying. So for example, the Museums Association's support for climate crisis is really helpful, because that's something that our sector is then prioritising. And perhaps sometimes it's not that people don't, depends who you're talking to, but it can be that thing of, a bit like the introduction to this webinar, that something like COVID arises and does something like climate push down the agenda. But it's that understanding that actually it interconnects, it goes across and through everything. So it's not this kind of boxed environmental thing that's happening separate to all these other things that are on our agenda. It's actually going to trump all of them if we don't address it. So perhaps it's finding, a bit like Alexandra was saying, those ways that it is relevant to all of our work. And perhaps that's not as immediately obvious for some areas as others, but it is there. And, without healthy environment, air we can breathe, this is the thing that's going to affect people more than anything. So I think, yeah, that interconnectedness and the frameworks around it are really helpful to find.
Miranda, what about you?
Well, I'll just be brief and admiring of both of you, Alexandra and Isla, and of the Museums Association, and of everybody who's here, because this is already happening. We're already doing it across the sector. This panel is happening right now, and I very much doubt there was a similarly titled panel 5 years ago in the Museums Association programming. And we're seeing a a global movement. I don't think it's too much to call it an emerging movement of cultural sector workers succeeding in turning the hundreds of big ocean liners slowly toward climate. And again, I just want to acknowledge that as a new museum with the pros and cons associated with that, as an explicitly activist and a single subject museum with the pros and cons associated with those things, this is one that's easy for us. The people who are on our board are on our board because they want to use the strengths of the cultural sector to advance citizen action, citizen of the world sense on the climate crisis. But this is happening. We're doing it together, and I think it's important to sink into that and to appreciate it.
Thanks, Miranda. Yeah, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. Things are changing, and that there is much more of a sense of movement, a sense of unitedness across the cultural sector, that people want to work together to move forward on this. Just looking at the chat and at the time, a plea to everyone watching the call to add your questions to the Q&A function rather than to the chat, and I can put them to the panel. I just I will fire off with the first question from in our Q&A section to the panel. So this is from Karen McDonald, who asks about the impact that COVID has had, and she says that COVID has forced us into different ways of engaging with visitors rather than bringing them on site. Do you think we should review our focus on numbers through the door and carry this learning forward to reduce carbon footprint of visitor travel and tourism? And there is this issue that this also taps into a bit that issue around sort of the personal versus the social and political aspect of kind of responsibility for climate change. But maybe I'm not sure if who on the panel wants to respond to that question. Should we reduce our focus on numbers through the door? Miranda?
Very happy to. I think we should, and I don't mean this to sound glib, but I think we should electrify transit, make it public, and make what powers it renewable energy, and bring more people through the door. I don't think there's a substitute for being together in person. I think we can all imagine, and I think we all have to imagine, operating in a hybrid way after this for any number of reasons, including the fact that events like this are easier to do with a wider multitude of voices that are geographically further spread out. So this has taught us new things about our capacity, but we're animals, we're mammals. We want to be near each other. And the sense of collective efficacy that comes from having a shared experience of, in this case, climate engagement in the same physical space. You can do great work online, and you can do very interactive and engaged programming online, but I don't think there's a substitute for that. It's in a sense a way of recognizing that we're part of the natural world. And so I would argue for a systems change around the cost of bringing people through the door in ecological terms, rather than for an abandonment of that, which I see as one of the key sources of our superpowers as cultural institutions. I know that may be controversial, but that's my first take on an answer.
Alexandra, you.
So in thinking about this, I was also thinking about my own, I'm very focused on our spaces being about health and well-being. And I've never felt the weight of so much concrete underneath my feet than being trapped in my attic flat during COVID. And my strategies for well-being just kind of dissolving and having to be restructured. And I don't want us to lose these feelings to cultural and social amnesia as we go into a post-vaccine world. So I think I agree in one sense with Miranda that we can't take away those well-being benefits of being close to people, of being in the same room, of even touch and those sensory experiences, which are so important to museums, and deepening that connection. But I think we also, but I think with the numbers through the door thing is, I think we need to rechange how we are valued and how we are measured for success. I think that should just be off that table. We should still be trying to get people in and increasing those, but we should not, because I think some of the things that leads into is that fast fashion or those excessive practices to get tons of people, because we're focusing on the number and not the well-being benefits of getting people in. And those are short-lived and long outlived by their environmental impact. But I think also we need to expand our idea of what our museums are spatially. So what are there things that we can do that are still a museum interaction, but are getting out into nature? So is it something like Philadelphia, where they had the paintings or the facsimiles throughout the city? And do we, if we're an art museum and we have a landscape painting of the area, we have it out in that landscape, and we have these maps where people can go out and find these and kind of engage with our collections, but outside of our museums. And so I think that's something that we can definitely do. And that's the beauty of museums, is we have education departments that are already working out in the community and doing these types of things. And then we have people who are in the building and they can do that kind of stuff. But I think it should no longer be a part of our success, or a very small part of that. And we should be looking for qualitative success, not quantitative.
Thanks, fantastic. So I have another, just conscious of time, another question in the chat from Bridget McKenzie, who many of you will know has been very leading figure in the climate crisis and the cultural sector in the UK. And she asks, how do we design experiences to enable people to face the truths, the worst case scenarios that are playing out? And not just the conservative models that were predicted some years ago, while not creating a sense of apathy and fear. What experiences really work to inspire hope without skipping the learning that is essential? Who wants to have a go at that meaty question? I'm going to pick on someone if... I think some of you talk. Sorry, Miranda, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, I'm happy. I'm happy to give it a go, and then Isla and Alexandra, look forward to hearing your thoughts. And by the way, I completely agree, Alexandra. The use of numbers as the only way that museums are assessed is barbaric. It's more just about how do we build a sense of collective possibility, and that's where my answer starts. I think you start with a sense of collective possibility and our shared ability, if we act in community in a public-facing way, to move forward on this genuinely unimaginable crisis. I don't think that if we were properly metabolizing the extent of what we face, we would be able to have this conversation. We'd all be so adrenalized, it would be impossible to speak in sentences or anything resembling them. We are wired as animals to respond to threats that are near, that are immediate, and responding to this threat in an adequate way will take massive efforts of self-intervention and a building community, in addition to all the other flavors of effort that will be required. So I think the most critical way to make it possible for people to start to internalize how bad things are and how bad they could get is to give them a community in which they can metabolize that with a feeling of collective efficacy. So it's a little bit of a dessert before dinner argument. The logical approach would be lay out how terrible it is and then talk about solutions we can help push for and demand together. But I think we need to flip that because the magnitude of the problem is otherwise so overwhelming. And I say that as a person who was demobilized for 36 hours after reading the latest UN report on where the pledges of the world get us in relation to a 1.5 degree trajectory over the weekend. So I think we have to accept that we'll have moments of being demobilized and of despair. But if we have connections that help us get through that have been laid as a foundation, we can present that information and tell the full truth without shutting people down.
Dessert before dinner is a lovely way of putting it. I think we'll all take that away. And yeah, I think that you know, that so much of this is about how we psychologically process what the scale of the challenge in front of us, isn't it? And how we and then how we react and respond to it. Isla or Alexandra, do you want to come in on that at all?
Yeah, I can give it a go. It's something we grapple with a lot, with working in a kind of cross-team way at the moment in Bristol to sort of try and think about how we can support people locally to respond to climate and ecological crisis. And it's that thing of hope is an important thing. Like fear is, as Miranda said, a demobilizing thing. You know, 94% of Bristol's population are fearful, and that can be a real block to any, that can be a divisive thing, a block to change. It can be so creating hope, but not false hope. You don't want to create, you know, like, you don't want to lie to people. There's truth. So I guess the answer is in connecting people, you know, creating, as Alexandra has put so well, sort of that kind of shift in thinking, like actually it doesn't have to go down this trajectory. Big shifts have happened in the past and big shifts can happen today. So if we look at the tracks we're on, and again, the collections have that potential to unpick history over the past couple of 100 years. I went to a very uplifting lecture by a cosmochemist who was talking about, you know, man getting to the moon. They decided they were going to do it and they did it. And that's not maybe the most useful analogy in terms of emissions and that kind of thing. But if we can shift, you know, it's not impossible. It's just that we're on this trajectory because of these systems that have been put in place, these ways of thinking. I was really interested in what Miranda was saying around, you know, actually it's the system that has to change. And we're not going to stop people going to museums. It's just that people should be able to go to a museum in a way that's renewable and sustainable. That's what we should all want, that which we all be working towards. And I think, you know, that we have to think that's a possibility.
Thanks. Yeah, I think keeping hope in mind is really important. And one other thing that just sparked in my mind listening to both of you was actually coming back to something that Alexandra said earlier about how we change our voice is really important, and the voice that we speak with when we're delivering these messages. It strikes me that we talk a lot in museums in general about diversity, diverse voices, making sure that we have that we have the right representation. It strikes me as well that we need to be able to maybe be better at sort of the same kind sort of code switching when it comes to talking about climate in the same way that we perhaps code switch elsewhere in our lives and in society, and that we need diverse voices to be able to do that, not just from the AME communities, but across the social spectrum as a whole. And I wonder if that's something that museums have really engaged with sufficiently to date on in the climate crisis narrative. But I will ping to another question from our chat, and this one is from Catherine Coughlin, who asks if you think that there is a disconnect between recognizing our role in using our collections to engage people around the climate crisis, and in fact the huge amount of energy that we're using to preserve those collections and display them. Do we need more intentional collaboration between the different departments in museums to be more sustainable going forward, to really make our own operations more sustainable? And that's something that we haven't looked at very much in this session so far, but I wanted to make sure that we had just a chance to think about, the museum sector's own carbon footprint. Alexandra, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I think that's so important, and that's something that we're really engaged with at the Manchester Museum, and a part of our capital project. And I think if anybody has a capital project coming up, or if you don't, you should maybe start writing a bid for one, is thinking about putting that into that conversation, and how can we become carbon neutral or even carbon positive, because our buildings do use a lot of energy, and we need to be purposeful with that energy. And I mean, if I could even plug, there's things we can do to maybe reduce our stores that we're being asked to do when it comes to racial and social justice around repatriation. And so that even becomes a part of climate crises. A solution that cuts across different things is, what are we holding on to that maybe isn't ours, and maybe we shouldn't have, but maybe would be more purposeful somewhere else. I think especially when we have objects that we hold so dear, maybe not necessarily the natural collections that we use for research, but some of these cultural objects, if they mean so much to some people, but they have to travel, and they're from their own culture, but they have to travel around the world on a plane to come see it and to interact with it and to live their culture through that interaction. That doesn't help the environment. It also doesn't help our relationships with these people. So I think it's what other people have been saying, is thinking about this as plural crises, and how it mixes in with these different things. But we do need to acknowledge that. And I think we need to think more strategically about our collections and if they serve a better purpose somewhere else, if there is that movement, and that it kind of helps with a lot of things we're trying to do.
Fantastic. Yeah, great reflections on that question, and lots to chew over. Do Miranda or Isla want to say any more on that point? If not, we have a bank of other questions so that I can throw at you. And then there's one that I did want to pull out here, from Wendy James, who many of you will also know from the My Primary School is at the Museum project, which has been really successful across the UK in recent years, and whose question is obviously around children and the role that they play. And she says, children's minds are maybe not so set as adults. So can you explain then how you are going about harnessing active children's programs in relation to climate crisis? Maybe that children will then go home and help you work on the adults. And I wonder if you have any good examples of that happening. Oh, Alexandra, go for it.
I think I'll just jump in. I can't share too many details because we're in the beginning of this. We're definitely doing that. And my part of my role is the Indigenizing Manchester Museum. I am so excited. I am an auntie and I can't wait to be working with young kids. But we're looking at reshaping our educational and learning development programs. And I'm definitely right in there as a teacher and an artist. And so we're going to be doing primary school education and reshaping that. And a part of that is going to be around Indigenous food cultures, Indigenous gardening, Indigenous interaction with the land. And all of that will happen out in nature. And I am looking at putting together some programming that connects collections and what collections can teach us about life, and cultural preservation, which for Indigenous people, taking care of the climate is the #1 act of cultural preservation. It's not putting things in buildings, because we live our culture. And some of my own people, the Jemez Pueblo, we don't record. It's sacrilegious to record our language and our culture and our traditions. So we have to live it, because once we put it somewhere else, it's dead and we're not living it as a people. And so our culture is fading. So it's kind of getting that mindset of how can we, little Mancunians kind of get into how they celebrate their life. So that is on my agenda. Let's chat. Let's definitely chat on that. I'd love to.
I know that Wendy's always up for making connections, so I'm sure that she'll take you up on that offer. Miranda, did you want to say something quickly on that one?
That's fantastic, Alexandra. And I just wanted to say this, I think it's responsive, but it might be a slight tangent. We see at the Climate Museum, and I'm sure I'm in no way alone in this meeting on this, we see one of the fundamental forms of injustice that's reaped by the climate crises as being intergenerational injustice. So every day that we delay meaningful action on climate on a society-wide basis locks in much longer periods of suffering for people younger than us. So for that reason, young people's voices have a special moral role to play in this conversation. And it's also true that young people have not been socialized into business as usual in the same way that people are successively over the course of a lifetime, increasingly, because we're such social creatures and such creatures of habit, taught to accept the fundamental norms of whatever business as usual you're talking about as being a given. So for both of those reasons, young people's voices are extraordinarily powerful. And we've seen them in the United States, and I would describe this also as a global phenomenon while deferring to you all, a radical transformation in the entire conversation about climate that we can absolutely credit the youth climate movement with causing. And so to build on that, within our rubric institutionally of moving beyond the existing climate vanguard to broaden climate engagement across the population, we have a number of programs that are designed to elevate youth voices and to provide platforms for them. One of them, for example, is a program pursuant to which kids do K through 12 students do research on science, the basic science of the climate crisis, the basic civics of their elected representatives, and write illustrated notes. So it combines arts and civics and science in a project expressing the urgency of putting something like a Green New Deal at the center of COVID recovery packages that are before the U.S. Congress and will be coming before the U.S. Congress. So just as an example, engaging with young voices on climate is a good in itself. It has changed the conversation. And there's research, at least in the US, showing that indeed children are the very best possible opinion and information vectors for their parents. We all care what the children we love in our lives say and do and think. And there's actually been a big generational flip where it used to be parents who set the political agendas for their families. And now, at least again in the United States, it's young people who set the political agenda for their households.
That's such a fantastic point to, I think, end on. Not that I want to end, because I think we could take this discussion on for hours and hours. But time is not on our side, and I think it's fantastic to end on that sort of note around hope, around the need to work with young people. And I think more broadly, the thing to take from today is that importance of creating a movement and really being able to work together and to seize the opportunities that relate to us, to our communities, to our museums and the collections that we hold. That everybody can do something around this, and that there are opportunities everywhere for people to take advantage of. And I haven't been able to keep an eye on it today, but I know that the chat has been really busy, lots of people sharing links and email addresses and things. So it's fantastic to see. Please do share emails and build those networks and build that movement. And the final thing I would say is obviously a massive thank you to Miranda, to Alexandra, and to Isla for joining us today and for sharing all of their fantastic insights and their expertise. And please do obviously also follow them on Twitter or the other social media that you might use. Follow also the Museums Association and do keep an eye on the other things that we'll have coming out over the course of the next year, particularly, as I said, in the build up to COP26 in Glasgow. And I shall end the session here. Thank you very much, guys. And yeah, hope to see you all in real life at some point.